we've been convening the Land and Property Inclusivity track at Chacha 2020, which is a platform for the development sector to think back and reflect on some of the challenges that we see in a world that has completely changed around us. And we really think that foregrounding land and putting a spotlight on some of the critical issues around it will be essential as we think about this period. And we're very glad to have both Kumar and Patricia today. Kumar, I'll let him lead the conversation, but just wanted to give a brief background on both of them. Kumar leads Land Conflict Watch, which is a platform that tracks different conflicts around land all across the country. Patricia, of course, needs not much of an introduction, but long-time journalist and editor of Shillong Times, and has been covering issues around infrastructure, land development in the Northeast very deeply. I'm really looking forward to this session. And Kumar, over to you.
Thanks so much, Shalmoli. I'm really glad to be here and really happy to be conducting this session especially with Patricia. I've followed your work so much to learn about the Northeast and land issues there. And I'm really glad that I got a chance to interact with you. And so I'm sure it would be for a lot of people in our audience today. So I'll start with a few questions and then maybe I would encourage people in the audience to also send in your questions here to Patricia, and I'll make sure that I put them forward to Patricia here. So to begin with, Patricia, I would like to first ask from you that in the backdrop of COVID-19, what do you think would be the developmental challenges that the region in the Northeast is going to face and the people in the Northeast are going to face from how the world has been turned upside down all around us? And I understand that the region has its own peculiar problems and also coming from a different cultural background, different governance structure. How do you think these challenges could be addressed? And actually, so many people, I understand that so many people would be returning to their homes in the region who are living outside in this region. So yeah, if you could give what your sense is.
Patricia, I think you're on mute. If you can just unmute yourself before you speak.
Okay. Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
yes.
We can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. So see, post-COVID, we're going to have a massive challenge of employment generation. Firstly, for the lakhs of young people, skilled young people who've returned. Of course, some of them have been in the service sector, but quite a few professionals have also worked outside. Now, after COVID, they would find it very difficult to think of returning to those places where they were almost left in the lurch. So the state governments of the Northeast have to really prime themselves up. They have to gear themselves up to think independently, because the norm in this region is to depend on the center very heavily. A, for funds, B, for direction. Then there is the Northeastern Council, which actually just funds projects, but really doesn't have a vision for the whole region. And in fact, I've been saying that what the Northeast needs at this point is another, institution that has substituted the Planning Commission, the Niti Aayog. If you have a Niti Aayog at the central level, you really need a Niti Aayog at the regional level, because these states are so small and so economically non-viable that they need to think together. Whether it's tourism, whether it's any other industry that we're restarting now, we will have to think together. So to me, the first problem is that this is a region that has just, say, in the last 20 years, got on to tourism in a big way. We have a huge international visiting, international visitors who come in for kayaking, water sports, adventure sports of all kinds. And much of our economy has depended on this. But now with COVID coming in, there will not be much travel, I suppose, for the next 1 year. So now the service industry is in the dumps. There are a lot of homestays that have come up in all the states. Now, how are these going to sustain themselves? That's one major question. And what alternative, industries or livelihoods are we going to think of? We are also an ecologically very fragile region, so we cannot have those huge smokestacked manufacturing units. You cannot have those steel manufacturing units that had come in because of the tax holiday. So governments in this region have to reinvent themselves, and I think COVID has allowed some of that independent thinking amongst all the state governments. I could see that Chief Minister Conrad Sangma, for instance, has been engaging quite a bit with the center on how to handle the COVID scenario in our own way, in a very nuanced way. So that's one problem. And the other problem about the Northeast is that we are internally very poorly communicated. You know, the internal communication system is so poor that it takes hours and hours to travel from one state to another state, for those who cannot afford air travel, of course. And even after announcing the Uran scheme, in Meghalaya, we still don't have, airlines coming in. Indigo had come in, and then it's just Calcutta to Shillong. That's it. And I don't think I can see anything happening soon in this sector. But we can have better road communication. I don't know if you've been to Nagaland and you've seen how badly, connected that state itself is within the state. It takes almost over 10 hours, sometimes 15 hours to come from one district to the capital city of Kohima. So these are these are huge challenges, and they've been challenges for a long time. It's sad that we haven't addressed these challenges strongly enough.
So taking from what you just said, Patricia, that these challenges we have known for a while, and the whole idea of development of Northeast is something which is talked about a lot. And it's being talked about in the same sense for a while now. What do you think has not worked so far in that sense? And now you see in the backdrop of COVID, that's going to be worse. So what do you think is responsible for this, and where the intervention is needed?
See, if you have been following the Northeast, you would also have heard of the Look East policy, which subsequently became the Act East policy, but nothing has happened on the ground as such. There have only been a lot of academic discussions. Now, if we're looking at linking the Northeast to Southeast Asia, what is it going to mean for us in the region? Because we haven't engaged with that idea, it's been engaged only at the political level, perhaps to a certain extent, at the academic level, but for us, people in the ground, we don't really know how we're going to engage with Southeast Asia. Although there are some states like Manipur, for instance, which have opened up their states for medical tourism. People from Myanmar come to Manipur for medical treatment, and we do have some good institutions in the region, which people from Southeast Asia could come. You have the Negrims in Meghalaya, which is, it's really looked up to for its cardiology department, and people from across the region and outside the region also come here. But travel has always been a major constraint. So we have to, I think, every state now has to chart out a new economic policy vis-a-vis, what has happened post-COVID. And then we also have to have a regional policy. I think these two should dovetail so that we don't cross-cut one another, we don't, waylay one another. So a lot of discussions now need to come in, and I think you know, our dependence on central funds is something that's, you know, making us beleaguered as states. We always feel that we need to go to the center with a begging bowl. So maybe now we need to identify our own natural resources and human resources. There is a very rich human resource because people here are generally very well spoken. You know, English is a language that people have mastered over time. And we have some really good educational institutions as well. So these are selling points. There are people coming in from Bangladesh to study here, you know, and we also need to be able to leverage Bangladesh to export some of our products, because we have a lot of horticultural products. The whole region is horticulture rich. And it needs to also have processing units, because if you're looking at lychees, they're going from the region, from Tripura and other places, they're processed in Bangladesh, then they come back to us as packed juices. So these are the things we would really need to be looking at. And I think now, you know, more than ever, you need a very imaginative political executive. This over-reliance on the bureaucracy, which has very little understanding of things on the ground, is not doing us any good.
Right. You said something very interesting, Patricia. You talked about the self-reliance of the Northeast, which now somehow has become in the national media and national politics after the Prime Minister's speech on self-reliance and Atmanirbharta model, which you sort of asserting that has to be done really in a genuine and in a very like honest manner. It has to be implemented, say, for the region of Northeast. So coming to the point of, say, political will in the region and political actions there, two things you said. One, you said that at the regional level, collectively, there has to be some decision making. And you said that maybe a planning board at the regional level, a regional form of Niti Aayog sort of thing could be worked out. I would go back a little and would first request you to take us and explain a bit that there is already a special governance system in the Northeast coming from the constitutional provisions, and there are special governance structure there. You sort of suggesting is that we probably need to strengthen a bit on that and create more cohesive structures there so that they work together. But first, if you could explain that how the existing structures have worked or not worked in terms of governance, how the special provisions have helped or not helped, and what could be the model to improve upon it or build upon it.
So, and just to add on to Kumar's question there, you know, particularly when it comes to land, I think we hear about the matrilineal system of property in the Northeast, and you have yourself obviously spent a lot of time talking about how that doesn't necessarily lead to more ownership or lead to more agency for women. And then land, of course, on the side of industrial policy as well, as we think about governance, you know, like sort of, you know, the conflict with customary tenure is a big one. So how does that really, you know, get affected as we try to rethink, you know, some of these models of governance?
See, when the Panchayati Raj, you know, the 73rd and 74th amendments were passed by Parliament, 3 states were left out. This is Mizoram, Nagaland, and Meghalaya. And the reason given is that these states already have traditional institutions or governance systems which are working well. Now, of course, they are working and people do have a lot of faith in these systems, but they need to be modernized. And they haven't been as yet modernized to the extent that is workable in the present system. For instance, you know, we have these traditional Darbar system. We have what we call the Darbar Shnong. In these institutions, there are no elections. There is just selection of a particular person who has to be male, because these are very gendered, you know. They are not women friendly. Women cannot participate or want to become the head of that traditional institution, because by tradition, women were actually not allowed to be part of the decision-making process in these institutions. So they are not, they're not democratic, they're more oligarchic. And this is a huge problem. However, during the COVID period, these traditional institutions are relied upon very heavily by the government. Although these traditional institutions fall under the ambit of the district councils, which are a product of the 6th schedule of the Constitution. So in Nagaland, in Mizoram, anywhere you look, you will find that these traditional institutions are actually really connected to the grassroots. They have grassroots connection. And the only way that government can reach the grassroots is through these institutions. But because the connection between the government and these institutions is very tenuous, so a lot of things don't work very well. And there is a lot of ego tussle here, which ultimately makes the common people suffer. Then coming to the land holding system of Meghalaya, which you had mentioned is matrilineal in structure, there is a lot of romanticism about women owning land and, having control over land. But there are two things we need to remember. Land ownership does not necessarily mean control. And I want to point to the 2011 socioeconomic caste census, which found that Meghalaya was landless. 76% of rural Meghalaya is landless, which means that women therefore don't own any land. And if so much of land in rural Meghalaya is not owned by the people, then who is owning it? It means that certain tribal individuals, absentee landlords, own those lands and are using them for commercial agricultural purposes. And all these women are probably engaged as labor. So this is not a very happy situation for a state that calls itself, a community-centered state or a tribal community. Because if you call yourself a tribal, you also have certain attributes of tribalism. What are those attributes? Some of them are that land is owned by community, and it is the community that decides who to give land to, not to sell it off, but to grant or to give land to people so they can establish a family and maybe a little kitchen garden. That was the earlier intent of how community land is given out. And there is also a system that if for 3 years a certain individual has been given land but has not used that land for 3 years, then it reverts to the community again. Now, all these have been absolutely nullified with time, and with the market forces coming in a big way, land has been privatized so that it becomes easier to alienate that land to some corporate or to someone who wants to do coal mining, someone who wants to do limestone mining. You know that Meghalaya is very rich in coal and limestone. And we have, for instance, a multinational called Lafarge that sends limestone all the way to Chatak in Bangladesh in those conveyor belts. So these are actually challenges for us. Our coal mining activities are also not the best. We have rat hole mining, which means that people are sent inside those holes which are, which are not even adequate for a person who's bulky to go in. So generally you send young people inside to mine that coal, to dig that coal. And very often you have mining accidents. So the last accident happened in December 2018, where about 15 people were buried alive inside those coal mines. After that, of course, the coal mining has stopped. I mean, legitimately stopped, but illegally it's still going on. The National Green Tribunal has stopped coal mining, but it's carrying on illegally, and there's a lot of illegal transportation of coal, which again means that the state is not earning any revenue, but some individuals in the state system, in the political system, are making their money
All right. Actually, you covered a lot of ground in this answer, Patricia, and I would rather want to get a little more specific on these. But starting from the first point, which rather Shalmoli also pointed out about the gender and land, and one way we see it from outside that the structures, the special land provisions of protecting community rights and the community governance organizations are rather progressive in as we see it from outside as compared to the central India tribal belt or from outside where they give a lot of autonomy to the community. But also saying is that within the community, these systems are probably very patriarchal, or also there is a huge problem of elite capture within the community. So, yes. And also we would also from outside probably see that given the more social mobility in the Northeast, women participation in labor is more. It seems like there should be more control by women of land and its resources. But what you seem to be saying is that it's not working probably because the internal systems are not working in the favor. So how traditionally has there been a resistance, and how these affected communities, especially women or landless tribals, are responding to this situation, or how things have been changing in the contemporary development regions?
Well, you're very right about social mobility. There is indeed a lot of social mobility of women in the region, as a result of which you have a lot of women moving out of the region. If you're looking at Manipur, for instance, the hills of Manipur have nothing, no institutions, no employment, facilities whatsoever. So you will find a huge chunk of women from the hills of Nagaland in Delhi, in Chennai, all the metros, they're all in the hospitality industry. They're all in these salons, or in these where they are taken for Thai masseurs and all that, So what really is the problem here is that even the female work participation ratio is going down in the region. It's not a very happy situation. Of course, there is, if you look at the female workforce participation, it's more in the rural areas because, farming, that means, is still a major employer. But we have to understand that the region also is not self-sufficient in food grains. And I don't know if it can ever be. Of course, there are states like Manipur and Tripura, which can do, they actually grow one crop a year. They could do multi-cropping. They could better their agricultural production. This is where we also see that there's not much, emphasis being given to agriculture in the way that it should be. Some states are rich in horticulture, some states are rich in rice production. So together, if there is a market in the region, it's going to be wonderful, because at the moment, what we are all looking at is the market outside the region. I don't think that's a very good idea, because we have a substantial, consumer base in the region itself. Then you're talking of the Northeast. I think you'll have to also have to remember that even though Meghalaya is matrilineal, its worldview is very patriarchal. And then if you look at all the other states, they're very, very patriarchal. Women have absolutely no rights at all. A few years ago, when there was supposed to be an urban body election in Nagaland, the Supreme Court had given the order that women should be able to participate in those elections. But it became so violent that they had to give up virtually, that the need to be represented in these urban local bodies. So actually in the Northeast, it's always one step forward and two steps backwards. It's not a very happy situation. So yeah, and also this landlessness, if you're looking at landlessness again, Manipur is 70% landless. Mizoram is 79% landless. Now that's, I don't know. See, Mizoram as it is very hilly. It's a rocky area, very mountainous. So there's very little land available for agriculture, but even that available land seems to be owned only by one section. A few years ago, they did some land redistribution, but it hasn't worked very well. So my answer to all this is that in the region, we really need land reforms very urgently. We need to have a cadastral survey, which people don't really want those in politics. In Meghalaya, it was proposed in the early 80s and late 70s. You know, there was a chief minister who was progressive enough to say, let's have a cadastral survey so that we know who owns how much land. There was such a strong protest because, and the protest was that now if your land is surveyed, then you would have to pay revenue for that. And why should you pay revenue when you're a tribal? But actually it's to hide the land ownership. So unless we have that, and then we also have a land use policy, then you know what will happen is we are giving out agricultural land for coal mining. Coal mining, in fact, has happened in forest land, also limestone mining. So this region is actually losing a lot of its forest, but the satellite imagery is not capturing all that. I wish we had a better database.
Right. You rightly brought in the point of coal mining, and I would like how we understand in the mainland India, they say about the resource curse, where you say you have minerals in the tribal belt in the central India, and then eventually tribals are displaced because to get that mineral, etc. But we see probably in Northeast, it's a different kind of resource capture and how it affects the land ownership. When, for example, in coal mining, we have seen this whole debate of whether communities own the coal and land in the region, or should it be nationalized like as a resource in the rest of the country, where the coal is nationalized and owned by the central government and governed by the central government. But in Meghalaya, the coal, red coal mining is done on the argument that because of the special constitutional provisions, the locals own the resources, land and its resources, and that's why coal belongs to local people. But it seems from whatever little I have read about coal mining and regions, that within the community also, it's not actually the community that benefits, but certain elites, certain politicians or elites. So within locally, it's a different kind of capture. And probably when I was reporting on that, it seemed like even the community land ownership is also changing because of these resources. Maybe the elites in the Dorbar Shnong or some politician there have been usurping the community land as private owners, and then the whole coal belongs to them. So how this like triple conflict between, say, the center, the state, and the communities and the elites of community, there are like multiple levels of players who want to own these resources. And how do you think the voices of people are placed in this whole conflict? How much are the voices of people being heard or given any sort of importance in this whole debate?
See, recently there was an attempt to take more land, you know, for a cement company to acquire more land to mine limestone. There was a huge protest, and I think that project has been kept on hold. But I'm also looking at institutions like the state pollution control boards. Don't they have a role to be with the people, to protect the people, or do they want to protect the business interests of a few? you know, this has always been a question that I haven't been able to understand, because these institutions are created to protect us from, you know, these people who usurp our rights. So now there is a fight between the community and the cement companies and the pollution control board. Just think about it. So far so good, huh? But we don't know when a section of the protesters also might be won over. And this has happened in the past as well. We do have whistleblowers, and very strong whistleblowers, pressure groups, for instance, who've not allowed uranium mining to happen, despite a lot of government of India's attempts. So that's a good example. But with coal and the limestone, you know, there's a lot of foul play, and you're not too sure when the appropriation will happen. Now, recently, again, there is that river Lukha in Jaintia Hills. It has turned blue again, and it has a lot of fish have died again. That, you know, that had stopped for a while when the cement companies had stopped manufacturing cement during the COVID period. Then recently, when they were allowed to start their manufacturing, again this happened. So again, a lot of voices have been raised. But, you know, nobody really takes cognizance of all these complaints and protests. Sometimes it's very exhausting and fatiguing for people who are in the front line of protests.
Right. I have a little broader question, Patricia, about, say, acquisition of land and development of infrastructure in the region. It seems that there is, from outside, there has been criticism that there are multiple levels of players in the region where one has, I mean, a developer or a government body has to negotiate with for land acquisition. There is sort of, again, from the outside, people critique and demand that there should be more efficient model of land acquisition. What do you think about this criticism from outside about these efficiency, the argument of efficiency, multiple levels, and within the governance structures, how they are currently? What do you think could be a more equitable and sustainable framework of land acquisition and land use in the region, especially keeping the infrastructure projects in mind?
See, there are projects and there are projects. I would like to believe that there are a lot of people who want to build good institutions in this region. And especially if the connectivity is improved, because, you know, climate-wise, we are really good for all kinds of educational institutions. Now we have the IIM in Meghalaya, you have the IIT in Guwahati. You could have many more. We have the NIFT also here. Many other private institutions also want to come in and set up shop, but land is a major constraint. Now, land acquisition has never been transparent in the state, in the whole region. There's always nepotism. There are a few people who make money, and that's the reason why it angers people. That is why even the railway project that wants to come to Barnihat in Meghalaya is being stalled, because there is no transparency. A few people have made their money and sold away their land and all that. But the rest of the people don't know anything about the coming of the railways, how it will impact them. So I've always, you know, proposed that if you want to acquire land or any part of land anywhere, you first have to go to that community there and tell them how it's going to benefit them. Are they going to get jobs there? What sort of jobs are they going to get? And so on, and be open to their questioning. You know, I think the more transparent we are, the more people will be open to giving land as a community. Of course, nowadays I don't know how much of land is still owned by the community, because as I said to you earlier, one attribute of being tribal is also that resource is owned by the community And when I say resource, I'm looking at forests, I'm looking at water sources, I'm looking at mineral wealth. But you know, water sources also are now owned by individuals, and these individuals are selling off the water to, you know, to all of us. So where have we gone wrong? We have the district councils, which are a creation of the 6th schedule, meant especially to protect these customary rights, but they have failed. And at the moment, you know, we are all debating whether we even need them anymore, because they seem to be short selling our interests more than safeguarding them.
Right. So, Patricia, I mean, there would be, so what, I mean, what's the way to go about reforming these institutions or bringing the larger land reforms that you talked about, also keeping in mind the development needs of the region? What kind of consultations should be held, and where should the wisdom come from for these reforms?
See, we actually, there is a huge lacune of civil society voices, you know. We are not actually geared to be a civil society that can engage on a one-on-one with the government. We have pressure groups. These pressure groups use pressure tactics. You know, they put the government on the mat, and it's always a very aggressive stance. It's you know, it's either this or that. And I don't think that's the way forward. I think we need to be a bit more well-planned. We need to be able to engage rationally with the government, and we need to also, you know, bring in voices from the ground. I cannot represent everyone. I cannot also claim to represent anyone. I have to have the community with me, not behind me. And this is what's not happened in the region. You know, there are a few voices that have co-opted the voices of the community, but they really don't represent us. In fact, we have militant groups also. Every state has a militant outfit that claims that they are protecting the interests of the people, but actually they are not, because they are all extorting money from us again and from government projects. So we will really need to think through, and this is where I think these academic institutions, these universities should be conducting their research and involving civil society in that research, telling us this is what's happening on the ground. How do we go about reforming this? How do we engage effectively with those at the helm of governance?
Right. I'll take a few questions from the audience, Patricia. One question is, what about the younger generation from tribal families accessing mainstream versus tribal identity and traditions? So if would appreciate a sociological perspective on this as well, how the younger generations are looking forward now.
The younger generation are also very confused. You know, they, on the one hand, they want to you know, their identity is important for them. They want to be seen as a proud tribal Khasi, Naga, Mizo. But they also find that they are being challenged, that this fight for identity is not enough for them to survive. So then they have to leave their comfort zones, go out and face all kinds of, you know, adverse circumstances, racism. I think, you know, many of them are really, really in a dilemma. They don't know how to deal with this dilemma. Now, after Corona came, they were called Chinese, they were called Corona, they were spat on. And I think that lot would not want to go back. So they'd be wanting something back home. But what is that something back home that they will, you know, they'll get? Is there enough space to occupy all of them? The youth are full of questions, but we don't seem to have the answers, and governments don't engage themselves enough on these issues. So that is all that I have to say. And I actually want to, now that they're coming back, the the people are coming back, the young people are coming back. They are arriving today, the first lot from the rest of India. So I would be going to talk to them and to really, have a heart-to-heart on what do they think is the way forward. Because I think we should now listen to their voices as well. They might be having seen the world outside, they might be having ideas of how we can do a better job in the region.
Right. There's one question, Patricia, about the Jhum practice, slash and burn of crops. What are the land ownership issues with respect to Jhuming? And is this a move to promote cash crops, making food security worse in the state?
Yeah, see, the government has tried for a long time to stop Jhuming. And in those areas that were earlier Jhum areas, now you have a lot of commercial crops. You have cashew nut, you have rubber trees in Tripura. I don't know how it's going to be once those, because the rubber trees, they really are bad for the soil and they deplete the soil very heavily. So that land, that means, will become wasteland. Then there is also this habit of growing broomstick. Broomstick is a huge commercial crop. Earlier it used to grow on wasteland only, but now people have started growing it within the forest. So this is another issue. But to the credit of the Jhum fields, I would like to say that because you have multiple cropping in the Jhum fields, you had adequate nutrition. Now you come to the region, people are very undernourished, they're low on vitamin A. There are states that still have rickets, and then there is, there's a lot of malnutrition. And in Meghalaya, about 56% of women are anemic, those who are still giving birth, childbearing years. So that's a huge number of anemic people. The statistics from the other states are not very, very, very accurate. And most states don't have statistics, for instance, on child mortality, on maternal mortality. And maternal mortality, as you know, in Assam is one of the biggest in the country. It's the same with other states, except that we don't have the stats for that.
Right. There's one question on the Forest Right Act. How critical do you think is the Forest Right Act in Northeast? And what are the challenges and possibilities, possible solutions that it could bring?
There's a conflict between these acts and our traditional ownership. When these acts were not in place, the tribals were looking after the forest, and they were using the non-timber forest products. They were using mushroom. They were, they didn't really cut down trees. Of course, it's also true that now we have a bigger population. You need timber, and for a long time, timber was exported outside the region, especially from Manipur and other states that have teak growing there. Now, after 1996, when you had that embargo on the felling of timber, from the Supreme Court, we did see some forests being regenerated. But there's always this conflict between forest owned by communities, forest owned by the forest department. So you have these reserve forests, but in the reserve forest, there's a lot of timber cutting, and it's not by it's not by ordinary people. It's by a clique there. It's by a cabal of people who make money and in collusion with those who are guarding the forest. So I don't know how effective the Forest Rights Act is, because ultimately it's people who are guarding those forests, right? Those people who are appointed by the government, but they're not doing their jobs. They're only preventing people who had traditional rights over the forest from getting their medicinal herbs, their nutrition from the forest.
Right. There's one more question the finance minister has announced today that the government will focus on investing a lot on micro food enterprises, fisheries, dairy infrastructure, herbal cultivation. Do you think the northeastern states can majorly benefit from these measures, or the poor communication, supply chain bottlenecks, infrastructure hurdles could hinder the states from benefiting from these measures?
See, it also depends on how we negotiate with the center. Do we have proposals that will bring it? Because I think every state will not just be given so many crores and go and do whatever you want. I think each one will have to present what their proposals are for the long term, for the short term, for the medium term. This region is so rich in medicinal herbs. I am only surprised that, our traditional healing systems do not find a place in Ayush. So how do we leverage this? How do we even have a processing unit for these medicinal herbs within the region? Why should we always have to take them outside the region? Even for food processing, I mean, look at all these fruit processing units. They're all outside. Some of them are even in Nepal. Dabur, for instance. Why can't we have a Dabur in the region? Why can't we have a good pharmaceutical industry in the region? You have a lot of pharmaceutical industries in Sikkim, but that's because of all the tax holidays and stuff like that, out of which the locals hardly benefit, because most of the workers there are also brought in from outside. I don't think that is a protocol that works. We need a better protocol where your local population have to be trained, have to be engaged in all these activities. It's fine to get these packages, but how these packages are used, for instance, now the Chief Minister of Meghalaya says we will give a lot of impetus to agriculture. Now, what does that really mean? What does that translate into? Does it only mean bringing those tractors and, having a deal with Mahindra and all that, and mechanization? What will mechanization of agriculture do to the local labor? Will it take away more jobs, or will it help us to be more food self-sufficient? I think we need also some studies on this.
Right. There is also one question about the internally displaced people in the region. To what extent the problem is currently, in your view, and what steps have been taken or could be taken to address the issue?
Yeah, so we have the Brus who are now in Tripura, who fled from Mizoram. And recently, about 6 months ago, there was a kind of a deal struck with the center that the center would give about 600 crores to rehabilitate these people. I'm not too sure that even 1 crore has come so far. And now with the situation, the economic situation being what it is, I don't know whether that money will come and how they will be rehabilitated. It depends a lot on the Chief Minister of Tripura, but I think he's quite out of depth in managing things. He's been saying a lot of wrong things. That's where we also need people with some competence to lead us. Otherwise, I'm sorry to say this, but if you don't have, for instance, a health minister who knows his subject, you don't have a chief minister who knows what he's talking about, then what's going to happen to us? We're going to be led, we're going to be just sort of will not get what we deserve. That's what I'm trying to say. And right. I think, coming back to the rehabilitation, I think there is, Tripura doesn't have dearth of land, so they can be settled. But what has to be looked after is the educational aspect, because a lot of these younger Brus will not want to get back to agriculture unless it's, unless you modernize it in some way and you show them that you show them a good example of what good agricultural practices can do to enhance your wealth ranking.
Right. I would go a step back and take cue from what you said about the Forest Right Act, where it does address a lot of issues in the central India about land rights of communities, tribals, etc. But in the Northeast, you say that there could be a conflict and how people in the regions see it as something which is being imposed on them while they already have traditional practices which provide them security over land and resources. But we also see that within those traditional practices and government structures also a problem, which sort of could give an excuse for, say, the center or the central laws, or say the outside market forces, etc., to say that, okay, we come and we tell you what to do, and this is the way to improve your systems. How do you think, how do the people in the region see this kind of approach of the center or from outside of suggesting ways to improve the land governance and infrastructures? And what do you think should be the ideal way to approach the issues?
See, there are a lot of consultants already coming in and out of the region. Government has this habit of believing that people coming from outside have more wisdom than, people within. The point about forest is that in a state like Meghalaya, and I'm sure it's the same with other tribal states, 96% of the forest is with the communities. Only 4% is with the government. So it is in this 4% of forest that you have the Forest Rights Act. And you find that the traditional institutions somehow have failed to do the kind of policing required to retain the forest, to retain land, to retain community resource. So having said that, I don't think an outside intervention is what we are looking at. That's why I was saying that this is a time when we really need a civil society that, that is not self-seeking, that is thinking of the long term, that can have people from outside advising us, but not telling us what to do, because you can't also have all the knowledge within. You would need some kind of assistance from people with past experience in other tribal communities, those who've worked for tribals, for instance, in Chhattisgarh, in Jharkhand. If there are such people, and I know there are such people, if we can work with them to come up with a framework that will not allow, the central government, for instance, to just forge its way inside and do what it did in Kashmir. So this is what we need to be working at.
All right. I'll go back to the question of gender and land, Patricia, and this is out of my curiosity, and I'm sure a lot of people in the audience might also be curious about. You did touch upon that majority of the society in Meghalaya is matrilineal, but say the traditional institutes like the Darbar Shnom are very patriarchal. So historically, how did this contradiction exist together? How did it come about to be there? How does this contradiction exist?
See, I've tried to go to the genesis of matrilineal, and there are too many, too many stories, too many folk tales, and each one is different from the other. So we were told that the Khasis were warriors and they had to go and fight to defend their land and to defend their women. So some elder in the society thought that it would be good to give the right of lineage to the woman, to the mother, so that in case her husband dies while fighting, all the children will, the children as it is bear the mother's clan name. And if she should marry somebody else, then the children still belong to her. They will not have a different clan name. okay, because they don't take we don't take the father's clan name. So children always belong to the mother's clan. But this has created a problem of its own, because divorce and abandonment are very high in Meghalaya. And because the woman has to look after her children, so there are so many women-headed households today. In Meghalaya, about 29% of households are female-headed, and about 30% of the population live within those female-headed households. And most of these female-headed households are very poor households, because most of the women are not educated. They do household labor. You know, they are all daily laborers. Their children are not able to go to school. So there's, you know, poverty is multiplied several times over. It's not a very happy situation as the world thinks it is. So that was the genesis of matrilineal. But apart from that, and then also, okay, the land passes through the youngest daughter. But my question has always been, how many of those youngest daughters today actually own land? If we do a survey, we will also find that a lot of land today vests with the male members of society. They managed to do it. You know, it's always easy to do such things in a society that doesn't have very strict laws.
Right. I'll just take one last question from the audience, and then maybe we could wrap it up. What would be your advice to the young entrepreneurs looking to make a difference in this space? Yeah.
I would like to see a more friendly banking system, and also for the state, you know, to make the ease of doing business easier, because we have a particular characteristic among tribal youth, which is that if they go 3 times to the bank and they can't make their way forward, then they give up, you know, and the next thing is they'll pick up a gun. So let's make the banking system more accessible to these youth. Let's make it more friendly. Let's also have other institutions to do hand-holding, to train them, because a young person may not have all the wherewithal. He or she will need constant upgrading. And some of them are actually doing very well. They're doing very well, and these should be examples for the rest. So we need a good entrepreneurial skill development institution in the region. There's one in Guwahati. I'm not too sure how well it's doing, or whether it's able to reach out to all the youth in the region. I think every state should have its own, you know, entrepreneurial leadership development institution.
All right. So I'll just probably try and wrap it up, especially on the points of land and Northeast governance, from the points that you raised, and would like your final thoughts on that. So it seems like from your discussions, you seem to suggest that there has to be land reforms in the region. There has to be land policies, land use policies for each of the states, and all these needs to emerge from within the community and the people who are affected by it, ground up. And that's probably is the way to go about for a more equitable land use and land acquisition scenario in the region. Would you like to summarize it in the end? Like what's the way forward from here, Patricia?
The way forward is to democratize everything, because as of today, there's nothing that's democratic about our democracy. We've long ago spoken about planning boards, you know, getting their plans right from the village level. That the villagers should know what they want in their villages, what sort of development they want, where would they want the road to pass through, and where would they want the water pipes to go through. There's never been any consultation of that kind. It's always some planning in their, yeah.
Sure. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So people should be involved in their own planning processes. It has to start now, because we cannot go on like this. Somebody at the top cannot be planning for us, because then even the kind of budgets that you have may not be realistic. That the state budgets may not really be realistic if you don't get your data from the ground.
Okay.
Yeah, and having said that, I would actually want that we need a robust civil society. I don't know how we can start doing that, but we need all kinds of voices to emerge in this post-COVID scenario.
Thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you so much, Kumar, for